Testing, testing, testing. I want to give a little bit in terms of the context and the legacy leading up to Brown, some of the key points that happened, and then really sort of help understand the kind of two different tales that are being told here. James Anderson is a professor at the University of Illinois. He's testified for the on a number of key court cases, been cited in the Supreme Court, and so this is a topic that he knows very well. And I think what he's trying to do here, and as a quick side note, like I was at the anniversary of the Brown decision, the 50-year anniversary um, years ago, and a number of people, like a lot of that kind of commemoration really dealt with the shortcomings of Brown and the problems of Brown, how little had been really kind of enacted in terms of school integration, and that's kind of where James Anderson starts, like noting this with Derek Bell, who's a famous civil rights lawyer, and notes the way in which it's kind of regarded problematically, at least by scholars. And I think what he wants to do is look at both sides of the story, both the positives and the negatives or limitations. So, A Tale of Two Browns is an obvious reference to A Tale of Two Cities, and the opening lines to that novel are, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And that's what he's saying here for the African American community. It was a long realized struggle and goal to get school integration. On the other hand, it created a major backlash and was very problematic. All right, so the first side that I want to talk about is the legislative side, the legal side, and the history of equality in relation to Brown. That's one of the tales that he wants to tell. And so to do this, we need to go back to the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution. So the Declaration of Independence kind of begins, we hold these truths to be self evident, all men created equal. And all men really there stood for humankind. And so it was the idea of substantive or individual equality. Now, what happens 10 years later, the founding fathers sit down to write the Declaration or the Constitution um, following the Revolutionary War. And the big problem, the challenge with talking about equality was that a significant portion of the country is enslaved. We have slavery, and women have, lack kind of general basic human rights. And so those two issues really prevented us from inscribing individual equality into the constitutional legacy. So it really kind of just gets sat to the side for a period of time. And then following the Civil War, there's a number of key cases. And one is the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. The 15th Amendment gave universal suffrage to males, or the right to vote. But the 14th Amendment really is kind of the one that's key to our story. What the 14th Amendment does it's known as the Equal Rights Clause, equal protection, or the Equal Protection Clause. So the idea is there's um, one group of rights holders under the law. We all have a kind of recourse to due process. So a number of things are inscribed to the 14th Amendment, but it's a very, very impactful piece of our constitutional legacy. And what happens though is after the 14th Amendment is signed, there's a period where there are attacks on the 14th Amendment, and he details a lot of them in the reading, so I'm not going to go into detail with those. But really, the one that ends up, I think, giving the major blow to the 14th Amendment was Plessy v. Ferguson. What Plessy basically says separate but equal. So you can have separate facilities basically for African Americans and whites. And this really ushers in almost a 60-year period of apartheid in the United States, where there are two different systems for people of color or African Americans, um, and for whites. And and so Plessy v. Ferguson is the major blow here to substantive equality. And I'll talk about how separate but equal was never actually equal for African Americans, or there were major disparities, at least in the realm of education. What happens, however, so the positive aspect of Brown versus Board of Education is that Brown overturns Plessy and asserts, and the language of Brown is uh, separate is inherently unequal. So it ends the Jim Crow era and reasserts substantive equality into the constitutional legacy. And this has a major impact after the Brown decision. So, for example, and some examples he gives in the piece is once individual equality is put back in the constitutional legacy, you get a number, you get rights movements for a number of different groups. And one example would be for women, and you get things like Title IX, or equal access to educational facilities, an emphasis on that for women. ADA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. All those things kind of follow Brown versus Board of Education, um, once equality is inscribed back into the law. Now, what the other story that happens here, however, is that for African Americans, actually, Brown had kind of mixed results, or was problematic for the African American community. And to give you a little bit of background here to understand this, um, in the Reconstruction era following the Civil War, African Americans did at least relatively well in terms of education. They started networks of schools, received an element of funding. But when the Jim Crow era happened, that changed dramatically. So, for example, Alabama's given as an example. Um, During the Reconstruction era, African Americans made up 44% of the population. They received roughly that percentage in funding. But in the Jim Crow era, that dissipated to about 15%. So one of the ideas that James Anderson notes here is double taxation. African Americans paid taxes, which went to support white schools, and then they had to pay for out of pocket basically to fund their own schools. And a really dramatic example of this that he notes in the reading is that secondary education was basically non existent for African Americans through most of the 20th century. Georgia, for example, he gives the example of Ware High School, where the court says, that Georgia didn't need to provide any secondary or high school level education for African Americans. And that existed in a number of states throughout the 20th century. So one of the things that happens after Brown is there is a positive uptick in African American enrollment in secondary education in high schools. But what happens as well is that there's also a major backlash against African Americans, or what he says is a double-edged sword. And some examples of this are things like, basically, one is that schools just ignored the integration ruling, and for a long period of time. So Brown happens in 1954. You really don't get a push toward integration in the South until the late 1960s, where that's when the National Guard is mobilized and begins literally escorting kids into integrated schools. And those things start to happen. And obviously, African Americans are in that position, subjected to very hostile environments, a major backlash. And as that begins to happen, the other thing that happens is that African American schools are closed. You have the loss of heritage, the loss of sports teams, memorabilia, those kinds of things. And if you've ever seen the movie Remember the Titans, it's kind of portrayed in that movie. The loss of African American culture destroyed the careers of tens of thousands of African American teachers. Some of that is data is cited in the piece you guys read. James Anderson notes that a few years, you lost 40,000 African American teachers, and then black administrators as well. So African American principals, teachers are not hired in integrated white schools, and so it decimates the black teaching force, which is something we still haven't fully recovered from today. Some other extreme examples that you get are things like Prince Edward County, where the district literally closed their entire school system rather than integrating um, over a 5 year period. So, and where I want to kind of end up here, in some of the last information that I want to give you, is where we're at today, and what sort of happened following Brown. And basically, if you look at the chart here, in about 1968, we're pretty segregated. And then we get a period of integration. So the line going up is a positive move towards integration that happens through the 1980s. And then you begin to see a sharp decline of integration from the 1990s through the year 2000. The reason for that is that through the 1980s, there were a number of concerted efforts toward integration, busing programs, redistricting programs that sought to integrate schools. The Supreme Court began to overturn those and undermine those through the 1990s, and they began to unravel in a number of different areas. And as that happened, integration has declined dramatically, and we've gone back to a very segregated period of time. And if you look at the year 2000, according to Gary Orfield's data, who ran the Office for Civil Rights out of Harvard and now is at UCLA. But essentially, you see that we're more segregated in the year 2000 than we were in 1968, which is the year that Dr. King was assassinated. I want to mention, and I'll send you guys a link to it. There's a really great article in The Atlantic that details busing, the busing program, and then how the busing program fell apart in Indianapolis. And it gives the example of how Indianapolis was segregated, experienced a period of integration, and then how that kind of unraveled over time. So I'll send you guys a link to that. Now, if you extend out a little bit, what you see is obviously we were much more segregated in the 1950s, and even into the year 2000 or 2010, we've declined a bit. We have, as a side point, saw an uptick in residential integration, which is a positive sign. This slide shows you a little bit around Indiana, and if you've lived or been around Indiana, you probably realize that a lot of areas are still segregated. The dark blue tends to be predominantly segregated African American schools, the orange predominantly white, and so you can see in Gary and Indianapolis you have predominantly African American schools, and through much of Indiana, predominantly white schools. And Gary Orfield basically looks at a segregated school as any school that's roughly 90% or more, one race. So we don't have de jure segregation or segregation by law, but we have what's called de facto segregation, or segregation by circumstance. Indiana's not nearly the worst state in the country. We're about mid-range, so we're not as segregated as other areas like California, New York, Illinois, places with big cities. But we're also not one of the more integrated states. We're about the mid-range through most of the different indicators. And this PowerPoint, as a side note, is available to you guys. So if you want to look through some of the data, you're welcome to do that. I think it's worth to consider. And one last final point here, and I feel like this is really important, but Professor Anderson mentions the David Berliner disaggregation of data. And what you'll often hear is that the United States ranks in about the mid-range, in about the 20 to 30 percentile range among developed countries in our international test data, the PISA, and some of the other measures. But when you really disaggregate that data, what you see is that a lot of our suburban districts would really do well among the other top performers. So we have some very strong schools that do perform as well as some of the other top performing countries. The issue with the United States is that we have the largest disparities in education, and when you average those out, that's why we end up in the mid-range. And what James Anderson notes is that a lot of those really low performing schools are underfunded, urban, predominantly African American, Hispanic districts. And I talked to David Berliner about this. He was at Ball State a few years ago and gave a talk, and he actually shared some of his slides with me from a presentation on this topic. And so you can see when he disaggregates, looking at the number of kids in poverty using the free or reduced lunch, that's where you begin to see those students who are in those lowest percentiles. And I always like to end sort of by noting here that there are a number of positive programs around the country trying to integrate. There's a great program in Louisville, Kentucky, in Boston. The programs are far from perfect, but there are a number of programs going on, and they're really spearheaded by teachers at the local level, at the grassroots level. And I always hope it's something that teachers will think about as they go, and move into their career, something they'll be conscious about and think about. So I hope this was helpful, and I'll share this with you guys and hopefully get some feedback from you.